Welcome to Victor Street Fiction, the podcast dedicated to blending song and story. Every month, I'll read you an original work of fiction, written by me, Pettit. Each episode also features an original score, composed and performed by Aaron Collins. You can find his other projects by following the link in the description. Our mission is to break the barriers of both the album and the audiobook, to treat the story and the score equally, and to blur the lines between what's expected in music and in narrative. Mostly, our mission is to create an enjoyable experience for you. So please, sit back, relax, and get ready. You're on Victor Street. Sundown in America, Part 1. Faded day darkened, purple, eastward over the highway. The radio, set to scan, switched from station to station, as it had since Clarion. The passengers didn't notice. Lynn listened to the tires on the roadway, a gentle hum filling her box with sound. Elle heard joy in the bells. Amish teenagers rang them from high on the overpass. Patch-bearded, the boys jumped and cheered when Lynn held her hand on the horn. Elle looked back as the car shot under the rusted bridge. The boys rushed to the eastern side, waving with wild ferocity at Lynn and Elle, the only life moving along the interstate. Automated mast lighting flicked on over the asphalt, although, with the nearing summer solstice, the daylight would hold for several hours still. "Night lights," said Lynn. "We'd better find a place to camp." Banjos blended with talk radio, while harpsichords hammered into jazz. Pages ruffled crisp over the Zydeco. "Can you imagine?" asked Walt in the back seat. "Roads in Roman times. If they had streetlights, they'd have to ignite them by hand, night after night. Some poor old man, hooded and hunched over on a donkey, would ride from lamp to lamp, carrying an eternal torch on a crooked rod. What stories would he tell?" The road, designed as a military runway, was a crumbling strip of endless pavement, white on the edges. And Walt felt sick to think that they weren't already at their destination, resting. Putting down his book, he said, "We have lights coming on, all on their own, all the way out here, where only we're driving out to see them. And it's like this all over the country, from sea to shining sea. Constant lights everywhere, in every nook and cranny. all the overlooked marvels of the modern world. An airplane passed by, high overhead, and was the only movement in the static blue. Elle rolled up her magazine and shoved it away between her seat and the center console. She stopped the radio on a surf rock tune, where harmonizing guitars leapt over the persistent beat. Title, singing in from the shadows, oceanic with vibrato. Lynn looked at her friend, keeping both hands straight and firm on the wheel. Will you find the campsite, Ellie? Maybe something off the next exit or so? We should leave ourselves some daylight to prepare for bed. She retracted slowly back to her original posture and corrected her alignment on the lane with calm. Bolt leaned his head against the trembling window, while Elle withdrew her phone from her pocket. Are you sure you don't want me to take over driving? Asked Walt, his tempo rapping with every pebble underfoot. I could get us to Greenpoint by 2 or 3 easy. I slept from Dayton to Zanesville. We packed the tents for a purpose, said Elle, thumbing the glowing screen. And my love of camping outweighs your dislike for it, said Lynn, finger raised, conducting the symphony of her point. I don't dislike camping, said Walt, but we're on a mission, and I want to get there so I don't have to worry about getting there. It'll be a gorgeous night tonight, said Lynn, and we're in no rush. Elle turned around to face Walt. She tucked her elbows snug under the headrest to brace her position. Walt's body appeared limp to her, atrophied, half spread out over the back seat. He was a patient on a mattress in a gangrene ward. His skin was pale and tinted blue, despite the sultry summer heat. Looking at him made her stomach tighter with distress, and it was already heavy from the road. To the knuckle, his finger marked a point in an impenetrable brick of anonymous pages. The lingering decline and fall. In the smoker's court, behind his favorite venue, he told her how I see the books I read weave into my reality. They become the stories of my life. When I've got a book, a real book, I have to carry it around with me everywhere. That way, when the pages make their way into my days, into my events, I'll know how to survive them. And rarely, she thought, did the books he read deal with pleasant subjects or stem from admirable authors. Gibbon suffered from a swollen scrotum and lived celibate in the shadow of an unfulfilled love. Better books exist for impressionable people to model themselves upon, she thought, especially when rooted words reach deep into the viscera and grow so out into the physicality of one's life. You're all show, she told him, reading Maldor at a concert, wearing turtlenecks. Are you even a real person? Are you losing your mind? She thought about when Walt had read Proust last year, and how by the time he'd reached The Captive, his hair had naturally begun to twirl. I almost left you then, her eyes reminded him. The way you took to complaining about every little irritation. The way you locked yourself in your apartment for days. The way you extracted an internal sadness from everyone who came to visit you. Digging in with your eyes and mining out their naked condition. You're nearing this point again, her eyes said. Over these 1,000 pages. But her voice worded it sharply. If we wanted to get there just to get there, we would have flown. On his couch, she held his hand. He said, "Elle, do you think we should move in together? I've been imagining us on that tree-lined street, down at the bottom of the hill." She said, "I was thinking we should break up. I don't know where this is going, and I've grown so used to living alone." She turned back toward the dash, out of his painful world, still involved. "We're only 20 miles out of Du Bois," she said. "We've never had a chance to visit, and now's the perfect time. Bring my life pleasantly full circle." The rumble strips rode up onto the lanes, sending Lynn abrasive signals to slow her speed. "It looks like major construction up ahead," she said, tapping her GPS. "It says that if we keep going, we could be sitting for more than an hour. Are you sure we should risk the day?" Walt counted the skipping stones, tossed up from the tires. They rattled in the undercarriage and nicked across the side window, skimming before his nose. Pieces, he thought. Roads that crumble and crack with age and worry. Now that nowhere is safe to be. This was once a way to escape the cities. A way to disperse the population. To decentralize it. Cast the web of roads on the periphery. This is where the early bombs could not reach. Now we know that distance doesn't matter, that it would be worse to survive. The roads mainline us back to where we came from. They'll take us to those targets, now that nowhere is safe to be. "I see one more exit before Du Bois," said Lynn. "There's a campground symbol off the state route. We know for sure we'll find somewhere here." Elle didn't respond, but she shut off her phone and tucked it away. Walt ran his thumb over the flip book pages, hanging on the silky web of roads. A line of cars became visible around a bend in the distance, all standing still on the highway, mirages rising off, bending apart the sizzling rooftop arches into splashing shapeless shapes, untouchable changes to the real, foiled alterations to the eye's receptive light. "Where did they all come from?" asked Lynn, leaning forward over the wheel. "We're close enough to Du Bois," said Elle, flipping her hand. "I think this counts. Let's get off here." "It's all the same in the country," Walt consoled. "If we want to call these houses over here Du Bois, I don't see the difference. Think of it as Greater Du Bois, and not whatever the hell this place is. Alaska." As they came to the exit, bearing the name of no town, Lynn guided them smoothly around the off-ramp, and they entered the old American grid of roads. The only structure at the corner was an abandoned gas station, and Lynn followed the campground signs away from it, northward into the trees. She chugged down the way, farther into a territory distanced from civilization. A civilization suggested by the until recently vacant, half-kept interstate behind. A steel sign with torn edges informed them that they were entering a region called the Pennsylvania Wilds. Lynn smiled. "When I was young," she said, "my father and I took a kayak down the Ohio River, camping in people's backyards along the shore. We stopped when we got to Cairo, where the river meets the Mississippi, and I wanted to carry on. But if we didn't stop with the Mississippi, we wouldn't stop with the sea. We would have never returned to the land, and the land is what we set out to see." Continuing through a twisted path of shadowed forest, she reached a straightaway and allowed the car to bolt. The stretch led them bursting into a meadow, sunlit and alive with calming evening rays. Fields of waving wheat surrounded them, rimmed by rolling hills that toppled upward in the distance, where the flatland gave into the stacking soil. Farmhouses off long gravel driveways rested quiet, far from the road. The campground sign, the largest that they'd seen here, was hand-painted and instructed them to turn right down what looked like private property, a hidden estate, rustic and built with old money. Lynn followed the turn. Tornadic wafts of dust caught the sun and refused to release it. Golden through thin branches of maple. Highland cattle shook flies from their shaggy orange hair, looking like strange, enormous, prehistoric men. Punk rock drummers with yarn strands concealing their eyes. Pointed horns protruded from their straightened, mud-caked mops, and they bobbed them against the bark and boredom. Focus on the quality of the evening's light and on the novelty of the strange grazers. Walt heard the pop of gravel before he saw the source. Not far ahead down the road, a gray hearse charged toward them, challenging them with its wide frame sweeping up the narrow strip. With a consistent, too high speed, it submitted Lynn to a high schooler's gauntlet, a game of head-on chicken, a joust. And keeping the tires on the path as much as she could, Lynn kept up her speed and retained her integrity without risking a scratch on her father's sedan. The opponent went into the tall grass, mowing deep into the drainage ditch before rearing back up. And, as they passed, Walt saw how the hearse was piloted by an elderly man. The man's long arms drooped like loose spaghetti off the wheel, and his sad face was held by a frog neck, displaying confetti freckles and rivulet veins, visible even through the tint of his darkened window glass. The woman, sitting in shotgun, navigated by screaming at the man and smacking him back onto the road with her purse. She wore a large sun hat, and she made eye contact with Walt as they passed, spitting out some kind of curse that he couldn't hear. but felt crack, deep and black like molasses in his soul. "Asshole," said Lynn. "Every day," she raved. "Always, always. People continue when they know they're in the wrong. They continue." At the end of the strip, they rounded a mulberry tree, blooming beside the hills. Looking back toward the main road, over a green lake of vegetation, Walt's eyes skipped along the jumping lines of soy. So many rows, he thought. So many fields. So many crops, organized and growing. The long land. "Why didn't we just drive over it all?" he asked, deciding after speaking that they already had. The road dug into the hills and wound upward over the muscular terrain. The trio lost sight of the farms, and they re-entered the forest. Elle rolled down her window to feel the fresh rush of the wind, the propeller whoosh of a passing picket fence. She listened to the perpetual road song, silenced only when they crossed a silver brook. Then she heard the muted words from the creaking covered bridge, with smooth wood beneath revolving round rubber humming. The summer felt fresh and fleeting to her, and she closed her eyes to revel in the experience, retaining the moment, to keep it forever and to surpass it, to press herself entirely into the short-lived, day-bright evenings of summer, to hold the summer in her hands. With her eyes closed, she rode the difference between the shade and the sun on her face, and she could smell the green leaves of the trees, and she could sense their teardrop shapes overhead. Then, Elle felt the transformation, that the car had come into the open again, and that the road had spread out into a wide lot, like they were in a boat with a purple sail, riding on the chopping sea. No, this was nothing like the sea. They'd come to somewhere diseased, where the unshaded sun was not as warm as it'd been before. The dust underneath turned to the loud crumble of gravel again, and the pure quality of the light, casting colors and calm over her eyelids, neutralized and paled. She surrendered to an unwanted reality and opened her eyes. Ahead, in rows like the soybeans, were RV trailers plugged into ports. Middle-aged men walked from arbitrary point to arbitrary point, like swamp-dwelling birds. But Elle didn't see any women wandering around. Not on first glance. "We've uncovered a hidden city of mustaches," she said. Lynn pulled up under another hand-painted sign, this one reading the name of the campground, and she stopped the tired vehicle. Walt noted the sign's poor and terrifying depiction of a famous cartoon bear, and he said, "This place is dismal." "I've seen a million places like this," said Lynn. "They'll have a tent camping spot somewhere in the trees, but up front, they keep all the luxury campers, concession stands, swing sets, etc., etc." "Is this luxury?" asked Elle. "The pond looks like an open sewer. Some of these RVs have bedrooms bigger than your own," nodded Lynn. "A lot of money is sitting in this field. A lot of wasted money if you ask me, said Walt. Lynn tisked. You don't know the country. No, he said. But how did this become the country? It's giving me good reasons not to know it. Again, their attention was taken by the pop of gravel from treaded tires turning. And Walt wondered now if gravel existed as a way to keep cars from sneaking up on you or stealing away at night, like creaky floorboards in ancient Japanese palaces meant to alert bodyguards of silent assassins stalking. A golf cart wobbled toward them. Strapped to the top was a large searchlight, as if the driver had lifted it from a film set or helicopter. The driver was wearing a weathered race car jacket, signaling with primary colors his favorite driver from the late 90s. Beside him sat an elderly woman who might have been Queen Elizabeth without pearls or jewels. She smiled with big white teeth, and as the golf cart neared, Walt noted the intensity of her red lipstick. Lynn rolled down her window. The golf cart pulled up and stopped beside them, but neither the driver nor his passenger left their seats. Welcome, the driver said, leaning low to look deep inside the car. His eyes scraped away at every surface, like a knife hollowing out a gourd. You folks looking for a place to stay tonight? Yes, said Lynn. Is there an office? Looking around, Walt saw what could have been a shower room or a bathroom, but nothing that resembled an office. Atop a stand like a gallows, a young man filled a bucket with a black hose. The sign above him read, "Non-potable water." I'm the owner, said the driver. Name's Gary. This is Mama. We have a house just over there a bit, back toward where you came from. If we had an office, that'd be it. But I'd prefer if you didn't go over there. Private property. We'd have to sick the dogs on you. He snickered, as if that were a joke. If you want a spot for the night, I'll show you one in a second. I suppose you're thinking of tin camping? Yes, said Lynn, with cheer. I guess so. You don't have an RV. Doubt you come all the way out here to sleep in your car. I can take you back to a nice place in the woods if you'd like. Not any other tent campers tonight. Usually we only get RVs. And then I get so many regulars that it's always a surprise when someone new rolls along. Let me drive Mama back to the house, and then I'll come back and show you where to pitch. He held up his hand, a sign to hold the trio in place. And then he went back to the wheel to drive off again. How much will it be for the night? Asked Lynn. Gary looked at Mama a moment, assessing. I'd say $15, he said, turning. Wait here, I'll be back. Walt couldn't see the house, but it mustn't have been far. Only 3 surf rock tunes, bleaching out over the waves in 2-minute sessions, came and left like 3 fully lived lifetimes before Gary's return. The volume was set so close to the bottom, so close to silent now, Walt wondered if he were hallucinating the sound. The three of them didn't speak in that time. They waited as if the time between Gary's departure and return was not their time, but simply a necessary period to pass through, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, graced with a soundtrack of songs long forgotten by 99% of the population or more. Forgotten by the trio even, before the songs were through. The seconds of waiting were forgotten, never wanted in the first place. Time spent sitting in a location, somewhere over the long land, under the darkening sky, waiting to be placed in another point on the leafy landscape. More places to drive over and arrive to. Gary slowed, but didn't stop as he passed. "Follow me," he called, and Lynn put the car in drive and followed him midway past the algae pond and past the 1,000 docked RVs. Gary signaled a left turn by waving his cholesterol-crusted arm, crab-like, over the 5-planked bridge. He lifted slightly off his seat, riding over the larger bumps. As the elevation increased, they returned to the dusty roads, cutting off the grueling racket of the gravel lot. Gary reached above his head and switched on the searchlight strapped to the roof of his golf cart, shining an intense round circle into the trees. Her phone withdrawn, Elle began recording a video of their situation. Walt became overly conscious of the sound of his voice as he gave his natural commentary, aware that what he said could be preserved for time immemorial. This is how horror movies begin, Lynn. They passed several intersections with other nondescript dirt roads, and as they followed Gary around several turns and random directions, Lynn pointed out that their car was now floating in an empty nothing on her GPS screen. Disparate paths encircled them, ending in various finger-nubbed points, reverting as the computer tried to locate itself. Walt held his hand to his forehead and scrambled his hanging hair. "Will we even know how to get out of here in the morning?" "Hush," said Lynn. Visibility diminished the deeper they passed under the trees, but it was obvious that another hour of usable sun remained. "He's showing off with that searchlight," said Elle, "and taking us around in loops." "If you call that showing off," said Walt. "These roads could go anywhere, Ellie," said Lynn, "but we don't seem to be repeating any paths." A quick flash caught her peripheral, and expecting a deer, she footed the brake. Instead, a little boy stepped out halfway onto the road. He was naked and holding a fishing pole. A small bluegill flopped around on the line, dangling in the air, and the boy held the line high with his right hand, watching the car with rapt attention. Once they'd passed, the boy began to chase them, and his bare feet accepted thistles and thorns without care. Elle turned her camera on the boy, and Walt mumbled out a wordless question. He gathered his thoughts and said, "Where do you think he came from?" Lynn drove on, eyes fixed on Gary's tailgate, emitting little puffs of dry smoke from beneath. More children ran from out of the bushes, and one group of girls screamed in the way that whalers might describe cannibal songs. from back when the world was wilder, lacking cultural sensitivity. The few who wore clothes wore torn rags, dark with mud and filth, as though dragged along the ground. One boy wore overalls, but he may have been older, as he was a head taller and had more teeth than the rest. Their hair, if cut, seemed more ripped shorter than chopped, and frizzed where sweat and humidity hadn't matted it down. They were messy, thought Elle, in the way that every child wishes to be, blissfully ignorant of anything in the world that may be better than where they were and what they were doing now. 5 children flanked Gary's golf cart from behind, and he made clicking animal noises, which the children enthusiastically repeated. They kicked up rocks with their shoeless feet and ran right alongside Lynn's car, not afraid of falling under. A bruised-cheeked boy with a large red birthmark over his eye smacked the side door with a knotty stick, thick enough to use as a handrail and a stairwell. The group of children trailing behind picked up stones and lobbed them through the air, raining them on the windshield like a storm of arrows. Lynn brake-checked them, and 2 or 3 children collided with the bumper before she took off again. She stuck her head out the window and flung her arm, shooing them away. She swatted a cluster of pebbles, tossed at her face like shot, and threatened to beat the children's asses. She heard Gary laughing from the gut, chugging along on his toy before her. The children did not attack him. In fact, one was holding his hand and being led along the way. The town could not be seen through the forest until the moment they rode in. The canopy was higher here, but there were just as many trees as anywhere else. One of the houses was constructed from sheet metal and branches, but most of the others were legitimate. Some were built by hand, log cabins and stone huts. Others were assembled by combining the whole portions of condemned homes and were like Frankenstein mansions pieced together. The houses formed a horseshoe around a central fire ring, and despite the enclosed arrangement, the settlement seemed lively, as people wandered about everywhere. 2 men greeted the intruders as they passed, leaning against a stripped white birch, drinking from a bottle of whiskey. A couple resting in rockers turned to see the commotion from their sizable porch, wrapped around their home. Smoke wafted from both active and extinguished fires, and a group of naughty women stood beside 4 men, holding instruments typical to the scene. A guitar, a mandolin, a banjo, and a fiddle. They stopped their song to watch the trio pass. Everybody stopped what they were doing and watched Gary lead the luxury through. The children disbanded as suddenly as they'd appeared. The Pied Piper would lead them no further, and attention eased once Lynn was clear of the houses. The villagers' shoulders loosened. They turned their backs and resumed their conversations. A shirtless woodchopper split a log. Walt heard the banjo's metallic sprint continue flowing in the distance, contrasting greatly with the heady trip echoing from the radio, draining into static. The fire pit circle laughed at an unknown joke, most likely about them, and the children watched the car disappear from the invisible, impassable border of their town. After a few minutes uphill, Walt pointed out a baby spruce with 2 branches like bare legs. Green boots of the Everest death zone. Who were those people? Asked Elle, looking up and up. Where is he taking us? The trail twisted past other intersecting roads, and then they turned left out of the woods, into the vibrant green. The field was well manicured high up on the hill. The road disappeared under the grass, became swallowed up by nature, and Gary carried on without hesitation, as though the road continued straight ahead without ever dropping out. Lynn followed suit, and the car rose higher up onto the flat plateau, where islands of dense trees were left to grow in pleasing gardens. The wind whipped the grass around like a wave, and the spherical canopies of the trees danced and swayed like the hips of Spanish dancers. A patch of wild wheat kept time with rhythmic arrowhead points, and white parachutes of dandelion swept through the air around them like snow. From the top of the slope, they were above the general tree line, and they could see the vast land in all directions, patched with forests and farms. The interstate looked like a model from here, another of humanity's gleaming toys. And after they drove forward a few more yards, it disappeared from sight under a lower parabola of elm-laced land. In the evening sunlight, almost unreal, unnatural in color, these wilds were an endless Eden. Tendons rose in place, unlocked from their only home. By the pressure on his finger, Walt noticed Elle was holding his hand, as they were both at their windows, looking out at the view, sharing unspoken joy. "This is the jackpot," said Elle, finally. Gary flicked off his searchlight, now that they were out of the well-lit trees, and he led them to the far edge of the field. Here, there was a picnic table and a few patches of gravel, presumably for parking. And although the land lipped high enough upward to see completely over the trees, the spot was close enough to the woods below that a short walk down a gradual slope would allow them to set up their tents under a forest canopy. Lynn parked her car crossways on the zenith, and they admired briefly the beauty of the world. "Sorry to take you the long way," said Gary, dismounting. "It's a little rough for some outsiders going through the forest, and then through that town, but this is the best place in the county to camp if you ask me. Definitely worth the trek." On his feet, Gary was an awkward creature, a forest animal. He lumbered as he walked, almost wobbled. But he was average in that he was tall and thick, like most men back at the RV camp. His arms and legs were evenly spaced when he stood still, and he concentrated on his stance, and Lynn wondered if he'd been injured once by the way he moved. The death of the car's engine came as a shock to Walt, who hadn't felt stillness for several hours now. Like a woken sleepwalker, he had to regain his sea legs and shake out the tingles. He had to relearn how to move his arms again in order to open the door. When he stepped out, Gary stiffened and fell back on his heels. A cat on a fence. "There's 3 of you?" he asked. Half out of the car, Walt said, "Yes." Gary normalized after a moment, and Walt asked, "Do you think there's enough room for me out here?" "It's no problem," said Gary. "I didn't see you when I looked into the car earlier. Just a shock is all. Like when you reach for water and get a sip of milk instead. I wouldn't expect to see a man in the back seat either." "Why not?" Walt recoiled. "I was sleeping, in case we decided to drive tonight, straight through." He closed the door and stood taller. Before this man, Walt felt as though his very presence was an offense, and that in order not to be attacked on every side, at every chance, he'd have to make this guy know that he wouldn't take his shit. "Driving through," repeated Gary, grinding his teeth. His mouth missed a sprig of long grass. "Where are you folks headed?" "Brooklyn," said Elle, closing the door gently now. Lynn didn't address Gary, but once free from the car, turned to soak up the vista in the open air. She stretched her arms high into the stream, allowing the wind to ripple her loose sleeves. Birds darted like brown boomerangs, not so high above them. Butterfly height here. "The big city," said Gary. "Never been there. Pittsburgh once. Punxsutawney more often than not." "Walt has a job interview," said Elle, introducing him with her hands. "So we're driving out to see if he can find some work. Lynn has some family in the city, so we're going to stay with them for a week as well." Gary smiled cordially. "That's nice," he said. "You'll make a nice trip out of it. You folks need a wake-up call?" "No, that's all right," said Walt. "We're planning on leaving around 6 in the morning. We don't want to trouble you." "Trouble me," he scoffed. "Shit, son. I'm up and out before 5 every day. You kids need some firewood?" "I don't know if we'll need it," said Walt. "We'll set up the tents, probably fall asleep in about an hour, and then head on out when we wake." "Walt, what would camping be without a fire?" scolded Lynn. "Mister, can we buy some firewood from you?" Every time a woman spoke, Gary's smile enhanced. "You don't need to pay for it, darling. And you're right. You can't camp without wood. I'll go get you some. Be back in a jiff. In the meantime, enjoy the daylight. We're losing it quick." Instead of returning to his golf cart, he walked out into the field. Pointing with his entire arm and backpedaling, he said, "My house is just down there, at the bottom of the hill. This field is my backyard. Long backyard, but I do the work to keep it short, because I like the grass that way. I led you around the long trail, so we wouldn't get tire tracks all over the place. I don't mind if we leave tracks back here, but in the morning, I'd appreciate it if you try to drive back the way we came up." He strolled toward his vehicle, and as he came closer, he said, "I won't be long coming back, and if you happen to need anything in the middle of the night, or if there's an emergency, you know where you can go to find me. Just down the hill. I'll tie up the dogs when I'm down there, too. Wouldn't want them wandering up here to find you. God knows. There's already enough critters to deal with in these parts." Lynn approached Gary with her wallet in hand. "Before you go, let me pay for the sight." Gary tried to start the cart before she got to him, but she was faster than his wrist. $15, he said. He looked at her with a confused and scrambled face, embarrassed or ashamed to accept her money, afraid of women's money. He stuttered. Did I say $15? He asked. He took the bills. You should be settled here then, he sweated, pretending to count the 2 bills. Lynn smiled at him to comfort his way through the transaction. She patted his arm like a coach would to a little league player, and then he stuffed the bills, crumpled, into the front pocket of his jeans. Gary wheeled quickly down the steep grade of the hill, and Walt watched him roll on at a speed that most might feel uncomfortable maintaining. A patch of panic grass sectioned off the land, dividing the tent grounds from Gary's house. But even after walking around the concealing bit of breezy prairie, Walt couldn't see the structure. He found himself mythologizing it, assuming an old Victorian, something charming and out of days of heaven, something a man like Gary might not appreciate. Do we feel comfortable camping in someone's backyard? He asked. But the others were far away and couldn't hear him. And Lynn had camped out in many backyards, the backyards of strangers, all up and down the coast of the mystic Ohio. It's such a beautiful place, Mom. The hills are almost like Scotland. I can see everything from up here. Of course, they aren't like the Rockies. Still tall, though. Everything's below us in all directions out. It's like we're at the highest point in the world. Walt, with his thumbs in his pockets, left Elle to pace about with her ear against the phone. A low fog hovered above the ground now, and he silently agreed with her as he passed that he felt a reminiscent tinge of the Scottish Highland character here. Something old and ghostly, covered in peat, ascending from the moors. Lynn leaned against her car, staring outward, analyzing the rising Allegheny moon. You hear the crickets? She asked Walt while he came by, leaning beside her. It'll be dark soon. The night should fall quickly now. Let's get our tents up. Did you check for dents and scratches yet? He asked, running his finger over the hood. Here's a ding, she said, glossing the car's body. Here's another. She popped the trunk with her fob. My dad might be pissed, but Ellie has video evidence, which will help in my case. You don't seem too concerned, Walt observed. Lynn removed Elle's tent from the trunk and handed it to him. Near Knoxville, said Lynn, I once saw hundreds of drifters living under a single bridge, like a secret city of the rural homeless. But this town in the woods, I had no idea that people lived like that. She stuck her head deep into the trunk and reached toward the back. Not that I'm surprised. I just wasn't expecting to see that today. Not like how they were established and their rejection of the established world. She removed the picnic basket and set it aside, focusing on the arrangement of the items while she spoke. Their lives must be so separate from ours, so self-sustained, so completely off the grid. What I wonder, asked Walt, is who hauled their houses here? Whose cars keep all those trails intact? I wonder how off the grid these people really are. You saw how easily Gary let us through, said Lynn. They were familiar with him. They let us pass because he was with us. Do you think they'll try to rob us in the night? She turned. Or do you think they respect Gary, and that his word will protect us? Walt choked on a laugh, his propped elbow sliding against the car, collecting its gray grime in a streak on his skin. I never trust a man like that to protect anyone, not even himself. There's something brutal about him. I can't put my finger on it. It's a feeling that I have around men like him. He doesn't respect you, Walt. You don't know the country. Your incompetency sweats off you here. This is different than the country, he said. She took her bag and closed the trunk, and then they walked together down the hill toward the thin edge of the forest, carrying the contained tents, slung over their shoulders like golf clubs. Walt looked up at the setting sun, where the rays streaked like magnificent ribbons through the altocumulus. I'm not going to get this job, he said. Lynn squinted against the bright nothing and replied, not with that attitude. Her response was automatic and meant to irritate, and she succeeded. From the bottom of my heart, I think this whole trip is a waste of time, said Walt. I don't know why, but I feel like I'm cursed. You're not cursed, she said. I don't know, he said, watching his treading feet flail. Things have been getting worse and worse for me, algorithmically even. I carry this persistent feeling of doom, like I have a bat-winged shadow on my back, preventing me from achieving success. Getting this interview was a lucky surprise, but as soon as I heard about it, I knew I wouldn't actually get the job. The universe is showing me a glimpse of the fruit bowl, but it's going to drag that fruit away, just out of reach when I go to take a banana. And not for the first time either. I wonder if I'm being punished for something bad I did, but I don't understand what that is, except perhaps for a flaw in my character and my personality, something intrinsic that I can't help being. I was once way up, and now I'm so down low that being raised as I was, I naturally default to believing that I'm being disciplined by fate or by God or karma. Fate doesn't exist, she said, and neither does karma. The only thing punishing you is your bad perspective. I'm not even the one you're trying to convince, and I know I wouldn't give you a job if I were offering, just hearing you speak. You're a fatalist from the onset, so why would I want you on my team? Are you fishing for pity? She asked. Did your mother only show you affection when you were sick? That would make a lot of sense to me. He grunted, resisting the urge to throw her down the hill and into the thorns. If you have no hope, she continued, then why did we go all this way? It's fine for me, I get to see my aunt, but why are you wasting what little money you have? I have to try to get this job, he said, if not just for the look of it, to feel like I'm moving forward. I apply for hundreds of jobs every week, but the internet has the market flooded. I don't have any connections anywhere except for other underemployed college grads, so this is the first time I've ever actually heard a positive response back from anybody. I have to go. She laughed and shook her head. Ridiculous. You make me out to be a joke, he said. But I'm not a joke. I'm struggling for essential resources here. You don't want a job, so you aren't going to get one, she said. If you really wanted one, you would have work. He stopped a moment to shake off her logic. Despite the hours of revising resumes, of composing cover letters, of whoring off his stated proven talents, she was right. despite the silence of the other side, the silence of God. "Do you think I'd want to work for anybody?" he asked. "You'd have to be insane to want to work for anybody. Working with someone or a group is one thing, but that doesn't seem to be how the system works. Some have to work beneath others for virtually nothing, while others are elevated to the top of the ladder like kings because of the families they were born under. Our culture has crafted us in a way that even if we become educated, free-thinking, liberated individuals, we have to place ourselves into subservient positions to pay for that education. And then we have to struggle just to afford basic amenities like food and shelter. We're worse off than we would have been if we hadn't gone to school. If I have a bad attitude, it's because I hate the idea of somebody else being in charge of what I'm supposed to be doing. That all my efforts are spent for somebody else's ends, and I'm just a leech getting tossed the extra pence. All the while, my beloved college runs off with my money to build more enormous structures to lure in future dupes swaddled in the myth that college will help them rise in the world. And the banks scoop up whatever change I'm able to gather, just to cover that month's accumulated interest, so I remain perpetually submerged in their ocean of debt. I don't want this job, so I won't get it, but I have to try to get it because I'll disintegrate if I don't play their game." He adjusted the strap over his shoulder and increased his pace to match with Lynn's until they reached the shaded bottom of the hill. He threw his tent onto the ground and watched it roll. Lynn opened her mouth to speak, but Walt said, "I care deeply about what Elle thinks of me, and you aren't helping my case. It's difficult for others to love you when you have no power, trust me. They fall off of you when they were attached so tightly before. Even when you're not around, whispering in her ear, I look at her, and I see the rope between us rotting. She liked me fine when I was active, when I was in school. But now I'm underwater. It appears like there's no way out. And when we plan our future, or tell each other our dreams, we know that we'll never be able to act upon them. It embarrasses her to introduce me to people. It embarrasses her to think about who I am and why she's with me. So what use am I to her if I don't try for this job? What use am I to myself? I'm forced to interview through circumstance for a role I won't receive, because they're the only place in thousands who have even opened their doors to meet me." Lynn clenched her Cheshire teeth and smiled. "I think you just wanted a nice vacation," she said. And this was a good excuse to take one. "I see this as your tendency to overreach in action. Most people would take whatever job they could find and stick with it, but you have your expectations set too high." "I've taken whatever jobs I can find," he said, looking away. "They aren't good enough. The money doesn't even out, and you just become further ensnared. Worse, people come to associate you as the factory worker, when in your head, that doesn't represent who you are at all. Then this dysphoria smolders your potential while you watch the years go by. I never thought the economy could kill, but I can feel it trying, pushing at my chest, squeezing out all the life inside. I'm not the exception that I thought I'd be when I was young. There are rules we're trapped within, containing our lives, and they aren't working in my favor. I've never belittled myself to ask so many people if I could work for them. I've never asked so many people for help, and I've never endured so much silence and rejection in return. I'm not the only one I hear singing this song. It's a song for our generation. We wanted more. We were raised content, and who would ever want to feel too content for long? Even when you have everything you need, too much contentment leads to stagnation, and stagnation on to death. I strove for an unobtainable future because I'd been brought up to chase it, and this overreaching ruined me. You're right, I'm an overreacher, and because of it, I've been thrown into a swamp that I can't pay my way out of. I've fallen like Icarus, climbing toward the sun. And it's made me feel shamed and laughed at for attempting to realize my plans in the first place. But it didn't feel like overreaching at the time. It felt like going to school. And the statistics show it. We're the first generation in American history to be worse off than our parents. Why have we made the price tag for an education a ruined lifetime? Lynn scouted around the spot with annoyance. Yes, our country has a debt crisis, she said. But that's the market, and you chose to take on that debt. You and Zuccotti Park. At least you have that degree you aren't using. And at least you aren't living in the woods like those people over there, Walt. You've been better off than they've been for their entire lives, even in the situation you're in now. Don't pretend like you aren't rich enough. Driving here, he said, jaw askew. We saw so many sprawling roads and houses, all wasted and emptied, abandoned. People have it worse off than I do, sure. Who would help anyone when so much energy has to be spent looking out for yourself and your own? The nation's attitude is ruthless against itself. Our modern spirit encourages despair instead of strength. So many people I know feel like they don't belong here anymore. They're shown how they aren't wanted. They can't afford to live. Some never could. The masses elected Nero because they wanted to be like him. A wealthy man to make everybody wealthy. A man who gets away with anything he wants. Scandals that would bury other men. All because what he says goes. Another lie, while all the wealth we're missing seems to show up in his hands. We're surrounded by active shooters that we've bred, hate rallies directed at entire races, oil pipelines that rape our environment and our most ancient heritage. People scream over fences about whose fault it is that the world's dropping into disarray. It's sundown in America, and after the night, after we fall into our dreamless sleep, I can only hope we'll wake again, unmurdered by the horde who left our world raving in the mess it's in. This was a country where once all were welcomed by intruders. Now, even those born into the system, on the soil, are unwelcome. We're all intruders, and nobody is trusted. His eyes looked dusted to her, like charcoal and clay. I've lost all sense of hope and all expectation for the future. I can't take for granted that the dawn will come again, not in times like these. Under the dark shadow of the canopy, Lynn found a patch of flat land near the bank of a flowing creek and removed her shoes to feel the ground with her bare toes. Looking up the hill, Walt saw the clearing in the corner of their car, where Elle was looking past them and above them, still on the phone. She was front-lit by the summer sun and standing within the beams, shown as fully and as clearly as the eye can arrange, as whole as a person can be seen. And Walt didn't recognize her. Only 2 years ago, he'd taken her picture in a field of yellow wildflowers, her smile like a Renaissance painting. And as he'd captured the light and stilled the rectangular moment, he'd thought about how they belonged to the same body and mind, and how they would until the end. But the end had already come for them, and she was not the same to him, and her body held a different type of warmth than it had before. She won't stay with me for long, he thought. If I don't get this job, she'll leave me. She's already tried before. And if I do get this job, I won't earn enough. It won't solve anything for us. She might stick around for a few years, but we never recover from the damages incurred. Our life will never be how it used to be. We are dead. A little rocky for my taste, said Lynn, surveying the grounds. But it doesn't matter to me. The elevation is right. Just stack an extra blanket or sleeping bag under you to buffer. I'm not worried about it, said Walt, shaking his head. It's only for a few hours. Can't be worse than the backseat of that car, as long as it doesn't get cold. Lynn opened her bag and removed the spikes. Then she withdrew the floppy carcass of her tent and shook it out. A few times, she said, I've slept on the ground without cover or a sleeping bag, just to see what it would be like to really rough it, without comfort or amenities. I've slept on fallen trees, tilted off the ground, leaning against boulders, wake with the ants. Sometimes you have to do things, she said, kicking the spike down into the soil, to prove to yourself that you don't have limits, that in a survival situation, you could sleep on the ground if you had to, riddled with tree roots, that you could sleep curled around a bough, high off the ground. You never know what you'll have to do to survive. And sometimes, it's best to know how to sleep through a storm, since you cannot stop the rain.